Greetings everyone. Thank you once again for watching my next video. This video is going to be, or possibly a series of videos, is going to be all about the First Fetter. Specifically all about realizing no self. Realizing that there is no inherent self. What I'm going to do in this video hopefully is try and go through as much information and detail as possible, all about what it is, all the pitfalls, all the things that you might mistake when you're looking into this, and provide as much detail and other references as I can to really get you to fully, not only to break the First Fetter, but to fully understand how it fits in with everything else. Also, very important, so that to allow you to go through and break the fetter without dropping into nihilism, which I think is a major problem, and not only nihilism, spiritual bypassing doesn't help you. So I'm going to go through this so you don't drop into that, or potentially I'll show you where you could so you don't, and go through as much information as I can. Anyway, to realize that there is no self, no inherent self. I suppose I should say straight at this, perhaps your first question is, I keep saying no inherent self. Why do I say that? And why is it important? Because it is important. This is particularly important so that you don't drop into nihilism or spiritual bypassing. And it goes like this. We understand the world through language, words, concepts, beliefs, ideas, thoughts, etc. All the same sort of reference, which I usually refer to as the conceptual framework. That's how we know the world, through language and concepts. And what we do, we have these pieces of language, one of which is I, me, self, Chris, etc. And we know that that's a concept, but we have the belief that that word, concept, idea, references something that is inherently real. In other words, something that is more than an idea or a word. This is why I use the word inherent. So on the one hand we have the concept, conceptual reality, Chris, I, me, and then we have what we believe it refers to in the world, which is the inherently real Chris, I, me, self. And the realization is that the concept I doesn't point to anything that can be found. Because of that, it's realized that there is no inherent self. That the concept I is fine, but it doesn't point anything to anything inherently real. Now, you will avoid nihilism by realizing that that is the illusion. And you realize that there's no need to dismiss the concept, the word, the belief, the thought, I, me. There's nothing wrong with that. There's only something wrong with it if you mistake it and you really think it refers to something that is inherently real, and it doesn't. And this, breaking the First Fetter, just looks at one aspect of reality, which is the self. You can actually do this sort of inquiry once you've got to grips with the inquiry, direct pointing as some people call it. Once you've got to grips with direct pointing, you can look at anything within this framework. There's lots of other facets of other things you can look at. So, but once you've got to grips with, the understanding between the conceptual and the inherently real, that one is the conceptual model of the world, and you can't find anything inherently real that it points to. And that is basically looking at the illusion of everything in the entire world. But all we do with the First Fetter is we look at one thing, I, me, the self. Okay. Been through a number of websites, and I've made another video of how a number of the websites get this particular statement wrong. Because how they phrase it in relation to no self is that there's no self inside this body. That's how they phrase it. There is no real me inside this body. That's completely inaccurate. Because when you break the First Fetter and you're looking for a self, what that actually means is you're looking for anything separate that you consider yourself to be. Anything. If you believe you're a separate body, then that is effectively another self which you have to look at. So no matter what it is, if you consider yourself that, which is separate from all the other objects in the world, that is the self. So when they say, oh, there is no self inside this body, they are really saying there's no self inside the self. So they're looking at one thing and not looking at another. So you must look at the body. But having said that, breaking the first fetter doesn't dismiss the idea that there is a separate body. What it addresses is, specifically, is that body you? Or what makes that body you? And how that illusion is held in place. That's what you examine. Another important thing I can address as well is nothing changes. Nothing changes. The only thing that you could say changes is if there is a belief that the word I, me, the self points to something that is inherently real, it's found that it doesn't. That's the only thing that it changes. That is the realization. Experience doesn't change. The way you reference the world doesn't change. And in relation to suffering, suffering at this stage doesn't change. I must say though that realizing that there is no self, breaking the first fetter, is a very important step towards the reduction or removal of suffering. It's very important, so I don't want to dismiss it at all. All I can say is we're not looking at suffering, we're looking at the self. Because one of the problems with this inquiry is that people go into this inquiry holding on to the idea that there is an inherent self that will go from one position to another. In other words, right now I believe that there is a real person that is suffering. And when I've realized that there is no self, I'll go into a different position. There will be a self who isn't suffering. That's not going to help because the self is the thing that's being examined. If you are holding on to the belief that there is an inherent self that will go through this process and change, you are holding on to the very nature of the inquiry itself. And the inquiry itself is to realize that there is no inherent self. There is no inherent self that will change, that can change. But of course, that's not to dismiss at all the idea of a self that will go from one position to another. It's just to make sure that you understand what's going on. The idea of a self lasting through time, there's nothing wrong with that. So the idea that a person will go through this process, break the first fetter, and suffering will somehow reduce, the idea is fine. It might not happen though. In fact, what happens at the end, it can't be estimated. The only thing to take away, and the important thing is, that we are addressing the belief in a real self. So if in any way a person goes into this inquiry believing and holding on to the idea of a real self that will change in some way, that's not going to assist. In fact, it may well ruin or scupper the entire inquiry because you're holding on to the very thing that you're meant to be seeing through. And so again, as I said about avoiding nihilism, this isn't specifically seeing I don't exist. This isn't about seeing there is no one here. It's not that at all. It's seeing through a specific illusion and nothing changes. So let me detail the inquiry. In one of the sutras, in one of the Buddhist sutras, I think it's the Heart Sutra, there's a passage that goes something like this. Avalokiteshvara is the name of a geezer, a bloke. He looked into the Skandhas and found them empty of a self. Now, that might seem like gobbledygook to a lot of people if they haven't understood Buddhism or what these Sanskrit words mean, but that is the essence of the inquiry. That is what you need to do to break the first fetter. When he details looked into the 5 Skandhas, I do a version of that. And what does that mean? The Skandhas are parts of the self which hold the illusion in place. The Skandhas I would look into, or my version of the Skandhas, this doesn't directly relate to the Buddhist Skandhas, but this is for my own inquiry, relate to this. First of all, the senses. 5 senses: hearing, seeing, smell, taste and touch. And how those senses linked to the belief that I or you are this body. I am this body because it is believed that the body performs the senses. So from that we get I see, I hear, I smell, I taste, I touch. Okay? And the I being the body that does that. Second thing to look into is control, and specifically control of the body. For example, I, this body, am controlling the movement of the hands, or I am stopping the movement of the hands, or I am breathing, or I am making this video. That's a controlling action of this body. So that's control. Third one, which is kind of linked in with control as well, is choice and free will, which obviously is I choose to move my hands, I choose to keep them still, I choose to make this video, well, not really I choose to breathe, because well, you know, I choose to breathe out, I choose to breathe in. I can go that far. Choice and control. Then the fourth one we look into is what I call mental formations, which is anything relating to the mind. For example, I think, which is generally like the voice in the head. What shall I do tomorrow? You know, that sort of thing. The voice in the head, which is akin to the sense faculty of hearing, because it's as if you mentally hear a voice. And also in the mental formations is imagination, which is as if you see. It's directly related to vision. It's if you see something in your mind's eye. And also, like all the other senses, like the remembrance of certain smells, the remembrance of tastes, the remembrance of feelings. Those are mental faculties, and they directly relate to the senses. So, mental formations. And then the last one, which I don't generally do, but some people do latch onto this as an area to look into for the self, so it's important. And that's a consciousness or awareness. Now, when I mention that, you might have come across consciousness or awareness in some of the other teachings, but specifically when I relate to that, it's a personal, separate consciousness and awareness. So, for example, I am conscious, I am aware, I know I exist, sort of thing, as a general thing. Now, that actually ties into the senses, really. If you say I am aware, I am conscious, it really relates to the 5 senses are running. Anyway, those are the areas to look into, which is my equivalent of the Skandhas, my version of the Skandhas. And you look into those areas, and as it mentioned, you find it empty of a self. And what that actually means is, you have the idea coming up, I am seeing, I am hearing, I am choosing, I am thinking. All those relate to a self. So on the one hand, those are the concepts and ideas we have about a self. In each one of those cases, you look for the self that is doing it. You look for a self that is seeing. You look for a self that is hearing. You look for a self that is thinking. You look for a self that is controlling and choosing. And each time you fail to find this self. And the inquiry is to compare the thought that comes up, I am choosing, I am hearing, etc. And compare it with what you can find in the experience right here and now. Right now, in experience, can this thinker, seer, perceiver be found? And that is the inquiry, and that is as the essence of direct pointing. To compare the thought that comes up with what you can actually find in the experience right now in this current moment. I'll probably be going through that several times in each of the videos so you can fully nail it. And in each case, this is important as well, in each case of the inquiry, you must do the inquiry. This isn't a thinking exercise, because the illusion itself is created by the thinking process. So you cannot think your way through this. It's to actually examine the thinking process itself and to see that the thinking process generates and is responsible for the illusion that there is a real self here, and there isn't. Hence, no inherent self. So at the end of the inquiry, you will have gone through each one of those areas and compared with the thoughts you have about it with what you can find in the experience right now in the moment. You must do that. You must actually look, do the inquiry. And when I say look, I don't just mean seeing. I mean, when I use the word look, I mean all the senses. Use all your senses to try to find the self. And at no stage within those areas would you be able to find an inherent self. And the realization would be there is no inherent self. That we can say it's all an illusion caused by mental formations and the thinking processes itself, even to the extent that there is a belief that there is a self thinking, even the belief that there is a self falling into the trap of automatically believing in thoughts. Even that, there is no inherent self there. There is no inherent self believing the thoughts. And indeed, the big paradox at the end, you realize there is no inherent self when you realize that there is no inherent self to realize it. The big paradox. But there you are. Anyway, I will make a further set of videos going through each one of those sections, going into them in depth, showing the pitfalls, showing the areas where you can look. Much detail as I can, much information as I can. If you have any questions about what I've said, please do write. Always interested to hear what people say, even if you disagree with what I've said. I'm not perfect. I'm always willing to learn, and somebody out there might have a better view than I do, a better way of putting things across. So please do write. Click like, please. Click subscribe. I'll see you all in the next video. Thank you very much. See you again. Bye.